Picture this. You wake up to discover that some of your most trusted allies have not only frozen your assets but also banned you from entering their countries, all with a single decisive stroke of policy. This isn't a plot from a political thriller. It's the new reality for two of Israel's most influential ministers, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. In a historic move, Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Norway have imposed coordinated sanctions that sent diplomatic shockwaves rippling through the heart of global politics. But what does this mean, not only for Israel and the Middle East, but for the entire web of international alliances and the future of global diplomacy? To understand the gravity of this moment, we need to dig into the deep roots of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a struggle that predates most modern states. This conflict stretches back more than a century, emerging in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when both Jewish and Arab nationalist movements laid claim to the same land. Throughout the past 100 years, this region has witnessed wars, uneasy truces, peace initiatives that have risen and fallen, and countless negotiations that have failed to bring lasting resolve. At the very center of this enduring conflict lies the West Bank, a territory Israel captured during the Six-Day War in the late 1960s. Since then, the West Bank has become a flashpoint, its landscape dotted with Israeli settlements established in defiance of international consensus and United Nations resolutions. For decades, the expansion of these settlements has been a source of persistent friction. International law, specifically reinforced by numerous United Nations Security Council resolutions, defines these settlements as illegal. Yet, year after year, new homes rise on contested land, deepening the hardship for millions of Palestinians and fueling a relentless cycle of violence and retaliation. The daily realities for Palestinians, ranging from restricted movement and loss of property to economic hardship, are compounded by the constant threat of violence both from state and non-state actors. The world has watched, debated, and often failed to act decisively. But now, the tide may finally be turning. The sanctions imposed by Britain and its four allies mark a historic departure from years of diplomatic restraint. Unlike previous symbolic condemnations, these measures directly target two sitting Israeli cabinet ministers, freezing their assets and barring them from travel to these nations. The message is unequivocal. Actions have consequences, even for those in the highest echelons of government. British Foreign Minister David Lammy did not mince words, declaring, "Ben-Gvir and Smotrich have incited extremist violence and serious abuses of Palestinian human rights. These actions are not acceptable." The sanctions are rooted in a body of evidence, statements, policy decisions, and recent escalations of violence in the West Bank, where settler attacks have reached levels not seen in more than 2 decades. This is not just about ideology, it is about tangible consequences for policies that have led to deaths, displacement, and the erosion of prospects for peace. But the decision is far from universally accepted. The United States, Israel's closest and most powerful ally, has sharply condemned the move. Secretary of State Marco Rubio insisted, "These sanctions do not advance United States-led efforts to achieve a ceasefire, bring all hostages home, and end the war. We reject any notion of equivalence." This public split between Washington and key Western allies is extremely rare and reveals deep fissures in the international approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The stakes could hardly be higher. Over the past year, the West Bank has seen a surge in settler violence, with attacks and intimidation reaching levels not documented in over 20 years. Human rights organizations report that in the past 12 months alone, hundreds of Palestinian homes have been destroyed or confiscated, and thousands have been forced to flee. At the same time, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza has deepened, with international experts warning that famine is imminent. More than 54,000 Palestinians have been killed since the conflict escalated in October 2023, with tens of thousands more injured or displaced. Israeli casualties, too, are significant, with more than 1,200 killed in the initial Hamas attack and over 200 hostages taken. As Western nations scramble to respond, these sanctions represent a fork in the road. Will they usher in a new era of international accountability, or will they deepen divisions not only between Israel and its allies, but also within the Western Bloc itself? Let's look more closely at the mechanics and implications of these sanctions. Freezing assets means that any financial holdings controlled by Ben-Gvir and Smotrich in the sanctioning countries are now inaccessible. Travel bans prevent them from entering the territory of Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Norway. While neither minister is likely to vacation in Oslo or Sydney anytime soon, these measures go beyond symbolism. They signal that even top officials are not immune from international censure, and they carry reputational costs that can ripple through global financial systems. But the impact is not only personal. The Israeli government, led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, has responded with outrage. Foreign Minister Gideon Saar labeled the sanctions outrageous, and an emergency cabinet meeting was called to craft a response. Netanyahu himself accused Western leaders of siding with Hamas, further inflaming nationalist sentiment at home. The risk is that these sanctions could embolden Israel's far-right, deepening support among hardline voters and accelerating settlement expansion. Internationally, the rift is widening. The United States stands firmly with Israel, rejecting the sanctions and prioritizing unity in efforts to achieve a ceasefire, return hostages, and end the war. This divergence is more than just diplomatic posturing. It has real implications for future peace negotiations, coordination on humanitarian aid, and even trade relations. For example, Britain recently suspended free trade talks with Israel, citing egregious policies in the West Bank and Gaza. Other countries may follow suit, leading to economic and political isolation for Israel should current trends continue. The economic consequences could be devastating, particularly for Palestinians. Finance Minister Smotrich has already canceled a critical waiver that allows Palestinian banks to operate with Israeli financial institutions. The Palestinian economy is heavily dependent on these links, as Israel controls key aspects of cross-border payments, currency flows, and imports. United States Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has warned that severing these ties could trigger a financial meltdown in the West Bank, potentially precipitating a humanitarian catastrophe. The United Nations has gone further, describing such moves as a blatant violation of international law. To put this in perspective, the Palestinian banking sector handles billions of dollars in annual transactions, supports tens of thousands of jobs, and is essential for basic services like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. If these banks are cut off, everyday Palestinians could see their savings vanish, salaries go unpaid, and businesses shutter. The last time financial restrictions were even partially imposed, the ripple effects lasted for years, setting back hopes for peace and stability by an entire generation. So, what's the bigger picture? Are these targeted sanctions the first domino in a chain reaction of escalating international pressure, or are they destined to be little more than a diplomatic slap on the wrist? History offers some clues. In previous decades, international sanctions played a pivotal role in pressuring apartheid South Africa to change course. However, sanctions can also backfire, hardening positions and fostering a siege mentality among those targeted. In the Israeli context, there is a real risk that the far right will use this moment to rally support, portraying themselves as defenders of national sovereignty against foreign interference. Yet, there are also voices of hope. Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand emphasized that these sanctions are directed at individuals, not at the Israeli people or the state itself. The goal, she argues, is to uphold international law and human rights, not to undermine Israel's security. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese echoed this, stating, "The Israeli government does need to uphold its obligations under international law." These nuanced positions reflect a broader debate within the international community about how best to promote peace while respecting the legitimate security concerns of all parties. Let's examine possible scenarios for the months ahead. On the one hand, these sanctions could serve as a catalyst for broader international action. If more nations join in, Israel could face increasing diplomatic and economic pressure, potentially leading to a reassessment of its policies in the West Bank and Gaza. A coalition of nations imposing restrictions on settlement activity, trade, or financial transactions could fundamentally alter the calculus for Israeli leaders. On the other hand, the sanctions might remain limited in scope, having little tangible impact on Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, but sending a clear message of international disapproval. In this case, the status quo would persist, with little change on the ground. There is also a darker scenario. If Smotrich follows through on his threats and the Palestinian banking sector collapses, the West Bank could be plunged into economic chaos. This would devastate livelihoods, undermine any remaining trust between Israelis and Palestinians, and sow the seeds for further unrest. There is also the possibility, however slim, that these sanctions prompt a rethink within the Israeli government. Past experience shows that even symbolic international pressure can sometimes nudge policy in a more moderate direction, especially if the economic or diplomatic costs start to mount. A pause in settlement expansion, renewed efforts to curb settler violence, or the restoration of banking waivers could open the door to de-escalation. But the political landscape in Israel complicates this picture. The coalition government is fragile, beset by deep ideological divisions. Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are not only powerful cabinet members but also represent a significant segment of the electorate that views concessions as unacceptable. If the backlash strengthens the far right, we could see an escalation in settlement construction, harsher policies toward Palestinians, and even greater resistance to international demands. For you, the viewer, these events are not just distant headlines. They have real-world consequences that can ripple across global economics, humanitarian aid, and even technology. International sanctions often trigger market volatility. If trade talks stall or if reconstruction aid to Gaza and the West Bank increases, global supply chains and investment flows could be affected. For business leaders, investors, and policy watchers, staying informed about these developments is essential for anticipating risks and opportunities. Here's an insight you won't find in most news reports. While the world's attention is focused on political statements and high-profile meetings, the most profound and lasting effects are often financial. If the Palestinian banking system collapses, it would take years, if not decades, to rebuild. Economic recovery would require not just international aid, but also structural reforms and renewed cooperation. The front line of this conflict, in many ways, runs through banks, payroll systems, and the quiet routines that keep a society functional. Expert opinions underscore the complexity of the situation. British Foreign Secretary David Lammy defended the sanctions, stating, "These actions are not acceptable. This is why we have taken action now, to hold those responsible to account. We will strive to achieve an immediate ceasefire in Gaza." Hamish Falconer, a minister in the British Foreign Office, placed responsibility squarely on Smotrich and Ben-Gvir for inciting settler violence that has led to deaths and displacement. Their actions, he says, have undermined not just Israel's security, but the prospects for a peaceful resolution. On the diplomatic front, relations between Israel and the sanctioning countries could deteriorate further, leading to a cooling of trade, security cooperation, and even scientific collaboration. The precedent set by these sanctions may embolden other nations to take similar steps, intensifying the international spotlight on Israel's policies. Yet paradoxically, the same actions could boost the domestic standing of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, allowing them to cast themselves as patriotic defenders against foreign bias. So, what should concerned citizens and policy watchers do now? First, pay close attention to the financial news coming out of Israel, the West Bank, and international markets. Watch for signs that the banking sector is under strain or that new sanctions are being considered. Second, monitor statements from both Israeli leaders and their international counterparts. Rhetoric often signals policy shifts before they are formalized. Third, look for changes in humanitarian aid flows and reconstruction projects in Gaza and the West Bank, as these will shape the prospects for recovery and peace. Finally, let's step back and ask the big question. Will these sanctions lead to real change, or simply entrench the current cycle of conflict and division? The truth is, the outcome depends on what happens next, on whether the international community holds firm and whether the Israeli government recalibrates its approach. One thing is certain, the stakes are higher than ever, and the eyes of the world are watching. If you want to stay on top of the global forces shaping our future, from major geopolitical shifts to the subtle currents of international finance, hit the subscribe button, join the conversation in the comments, and get ready for our next deep dive into the stories that matter most. Because in today's world, understanding these dynamics isn't just for diplomats or